Hello, everyone. I'm Kathy Nash with the ACES staff, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is entitled Introduction to the DDI Metadata Standard. It's sponsored by ACES and DCMI. We have a very distinguished panel today. We have Barry Radler, Jane Fry, Jared Lau, and Arifan Gregory. Our moderator is Jacob Jett, and he's the webinar coordinator for DCMI. I just want to remind the audience, as you have questions today, please type them in the question panel box, and Jacob is going to moderate the questions, and all of the panelists will participate and answer your questions after the presentation. I'm now going to turn it over to Jacob to make the introductions. Jacob?
All right, thank you, Kathy. As Kathy mentioned, I'm Jacob Jett. I'm the webinar coordinator for the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative. We have with us today some experts from the Data Documentation Initiative. We're going to talk about their metadata standard. We have Jane Fry from Carleton University, Arifan Gregory, who's a consultant from CoData, Jared Lau from the University of Michigan, and Barry Radler from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I will mention Arifan is having some connectivity issues, so he's going to go without any video. And because we have so much content and so many panel members, I'm actually going to cut my introductions that I would normally do a bit shorter today and let our panel take it away.
Thanks very much, Jacob, and thanks to ACES and the Dublin Core community for hosting us today. We're going to be talking about the Data Documentation Initiative. It's a free and open international metadata standard. I'm Jared Lau. I'm the Executive Director of DDI, the DDI Alliance. I also work at ICPSR, a data repository, and I'm going to give a brief overview of what DDI is, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues who work directly with DDI to share about the different products. DDI is it's an open standard designed for data sharing and reuse, and it's used right now primarily in the social and behavioral sciences, although we're looking at integrating with other domains. DDI is a structure for describing data and its related information, and it does a really good job of describing data from surveys and other observation-based data collection methods. We're currently moving towards covering new data types and data from other domains. We'll talk about that later. So the DDI products, we have a number of existing products that have been released for several years. The DDI standards developed over time. Our two main products will be DDI Codebook, which Jane, my colleague, will discuss next, and then DDI Lifecycle, which Barry will discuss after Jane. Each product is designed for a different purpose. There are other products that we've released over the years, including controlled vocabularies, RDF, a standard data transformation language that was released just last year. And you can visit this website to see more. Developing products. So we have a number of products in the works, including what's called DDI cross-domain integration, DDI CDI, and Arifan will go into details of what that is later. DDI users are all around the world, including many agencies. I've listed the agencies here and projects. Harvard and Dataverse make use of DDI for their metadata. Norway, Statistics Canada, and a number of other places, including these projects that we've listed. And this is just a map showing the different places that we know about that are making use of DDI. So the Alliance structure is such that we're a self-sustaining member organization. We've been in existence for close to 20 years. All of our members have a voice in our development, and it's really this member-driven organization. So we have an executive board that sets policy and oversight, and that's composed of representatives from the members. We have a scientific board that facilitates the scientific and technical work. We have a technical committee that maintains and updates the various products. And then we have working groups that can be established by either the executive board or the scientific board. and those are convened to work on different activities and topics. This is our website. I invite all of you to explore what we have to offer here. It details more about membership, about events, about the different products. So as a member organization, we like to outline what the benefits are. So I mentioned it's member driven. So we have votes that help establish additions and modifications to our specifications. Members can be elected to leadership and set policy in the direction of what we're doing. Members have a seat at annual meetings, including the annual meeting of members, which is kind of the business meeting, and the annual meeting of the scientific community. They can participate on working groups, display the Alliance trademarks, and other things. Next slide. So that's an overview of what DDI and the DDI Alliance is. I'm just thinking in terms of DDI and Dublin Core for this community. We wanted to just give a few slides about how we relate to Dublin Core. Dublin Core addresses a very broad range of materials and does it well. It's really the challenge is to create order from chaos. DDI addresses a very narrow focus description of data. And our scope in the past has been within the social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And the challenge for us is to provide a standard model for already well-structured information. Fundamentally, DDI applies Dublin Core to its focus domains for citations and other relevant purposes. Next slide. DDI supported Dublin Core in various ways over the years. We had initial mapping, so with our original DDI codebook, the support has expanded over time. With DDI Lifecycle and later versions of DDI codebook, the Dublin Core namespace is directly used. And with the developing product DDI CDI, support for Dublin Core will continue. So implementations of DDI often use the metadata to produce Dublin Core information as required as a function of dissemination. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jane, who will discuss that first product, DDI Codebook.
Thank you, Jared. I'm going to end up talking to you for about 10 minutes about the codebook. Okay, next slide, please. So I'd like to start off with this illustration for the codebook. On the left-hand side of the screen, you have a box of Lego pieces, and unless you have the plan, you don't really know what you're going to be making from this box of Lego pieces. So in other words, you need the metadata manager to tell you what the piece of Lego is that you're going to be putting together, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. And that's just, if the metadata were structured by the DDI codebook, then that is the piece of Lego that you would get when you put together all the little pieces. So the codebook is a structure facilitating the production of machine-readable codebooks and data dictionaries. Really, it's built to emulate a physical codebook. That is, it's built to describe and catalog a data set or to describe a single study. Now, it's expressed in an XML schema, and because of that, different tools are needed to interpret it. The popular ones include Nestar, Collectica, and Dataverse. And the latest version of DDI Codebook is version 2.5. And it's relatively straightforward. It contains 5 sections: the document description, the study description, the data files description, a variable description, and other study-related materials. Now I'll tell you a bit about each section. And we'll start with section 1, which is the document description. This describes the actual document that you are putting together to describe the survey or study. And some of the examples of tags are the title, the date, and the author. Now for the date tag, if I was the one putting this together and I was doing this a year ago, then the date that would be in there would be April of 2020. And the author of the document would be Carleton University. Next slide, please. The next section is the actual study description. And it's what it says. It describes the actual survey or study that was conducted. For example, what was the purpose of this study? How was it conducted? Why was it conducted? Where was it conducted? How long did it take? And was there any funding for the study? This particular section does not describe the actual data file. Now, I trained students for years how to do markup, and before I trained them, I learned how to do it myself. And one of the areas of confusion for myself at the beginning and for all the students is that many of the metadata tags in section 2, which is the study description, are the same as the ones in the first section, which is a document description. And that makes sense because you're talking about a certain survey or study. So of course the information about that is going to be in both section 1 and section 2. Next slide, please. The third section is quite easy. It's the data files description, so it's exactly what it says. It will describe the data files that were created by the actual study. An example of some of the tags are the number of variables, the number of cases, and the structure of the data file. Section 4 is a variable description, and this can easily be the biggest section of the whole code book. It contains any and all information there is about each and every variable in the data file. If you imagine a general social survey that is being described, and it can have 700 to 1,000 variables, so it would be a fairly big section. But if you're only describing the variables that are in, let's say, a public opinion poll that's quite short, there may only be 100 variables that have to be described. So this would be a shorter section. Some of the tag examples are the question text, and that would include any pre-questions, the variable label, all the values and associated labels for that particular variable, the population of the variable. For example, if you've selected out certain respondents to answer certain questions, then they would be the population described for that particular variable. And any additional notes would also be included here. For example, were there any instructions that were given to the interviewer? And section 5 is the easiest section to do. It's for other study-related materials. And these are documents that are separate from the particular file you are creating. So what you basically do is give the title of the document and a link so that whoever is reading it can download that document separately. For example, this would include questionnaires, user guides, or code books, or any other related materials you think should be included with this particular survey. Now, after talking to you about different tags, of course, I have to give you an example of what tags look like. I'm sure there are some of you in the audience today who can actually read XML, and so you can read what is in the angle brackets. But what I've done is I've bolded the information that you would be reading if you were looking at the finished document. So there's 4 examples here, and the first example is for the Canadian Community Health Survey. Now you have a questionnaire included here, and there's also one of the notes for the data description section which says the variables in the study are identical to earlier waves. The second example is from a Canadian Gallup poll, and it's telling you that quality checks were performed by the Carleton University Data Center. And you can see the XML tags on either end of the bolded print. The third example is from the Survey of Household Spending, and it tells you that there are 255 variables in this particular study. And the last example from another Canadian Gallup poll tells you the information that's used for the copyright. Now, one thing I like to talk about here is something called the best practices document. This is something that we put together when we were marking up for Odyssey, which is the Ontario data portal, which uses the Nestar platform. Now, we put it together originally in 2010, and we started with the DDI Alliance technical document. Now, I'm not a techie, and many of the students I hire are not techies either. So I wanted to make this document understandable for them so that they could hit the ground running and be able to mark up documents as quickly and correctly as possible. So what we did was we put together this document and we put in lots of examples for the tags so the students would be able to figure out exactly the information they were supposed to put in when they were marking up the tag. So this is really great for training purposes, and I have the link to the document in the title of the slide here. Feel free to use it and read it as much as you want to. So here's a picture of what the cover looks like, and you can see that it is from January 19. Now the BPD has 98 pages, and it contains 173 possible tags. This does not mean you will be using all the tags. However, these are the ones that you potentially could use. Next slide, please. So I have to show you an example of what one of the tags looks like. So this particular tag is tag 1.1.6.3. So you know from the one at the beginning that it's from the first section, which is the document description. And in the angle brackets, you can see that this particular tag is called notes. The top part of the tag is copied directly over from the DDI Alliance technical document. The bottom part of the tag is all the information that I added when I put the document together. So it starts off with a note just telling you what to do with this tag. And this particular tag then has 3 examples so that you can figure out what exactly you're supposed to be putting in this note. And I want to add some of the revisions, minor revisions we did over the year would include more examples from students coming to me and going, I still don't understand these examples. This is the type of survey I have. What would I put in here? So I would find an example for them and then I would include it in the document. And now it's over to Barry to tell you about DDI Lifecycle. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. So good morning, everybody. I'm going to be talking about DDI Lifecycle, which is intended to document more phases of the research data lifecycle than Codebook is. And it's particularly suited to describing linked or longitudinal data. You can find technical details about the life cycle spec and the model on the DDI Alliance website under the products tab, as Jared had mentioned, along with a suite of other data management products that are managed by the Alliance. Now, on that page, you can also find a link to a GitHub page for the DDI spec. And this is probably your best bet is for a single page of technical documentation about DDI Lifecycle. It's a comprehensive guide to the content, to the topics, to the items of the standard, and it's generated directly from the model itself, which is a really nice thing. Now, as a survey researcher, I'm not conversant about lifecycle the way a tools developer or a data scientist might be. Like Jane just said, I'm not a techie, but I know how DDI benefits documenting complex data sets and studies, and I'm going to briefly review one that uses DDI to describe its study and variables. Midas, or midlife in the United States, is a study that I help run and manage. And just a few characteristics about Midas. It's a national longitudinal study of health and well-being that was begun in 1995. Midas has multiple samples obtaining longitudinal data over relatively long intervals, about 9 to 10 years between assessments. It's a truly multidisciplinary design. It's comprised of 5 distinct data collection projects that collect survey, cognitive, daily diary, biomarker, and neuroscience data. And each of those projects generate their own data sets. So this multidisciplinary approach has produced a large and growing amount of longitudinal data, all of which is meant to be integrated or linked by researchers and analysts. Archiving and distributing Midas materials through ICPSR has resulted in really widespread secondary use of Midas data. And ICPSR uses DDI-Codebook, but Midas really needed something more robust to describe longitudinal data sets. So Midas helped develop a DDI Lifecycle driven portal created by Collectica to realize a number of benefits. And these are among the most important benefits that Lifecycle and Collectica have produced for Midas. And the next slides are screenshots from the portal that will very briefly demonstrate each of these benefits. This is simply a shot of the portal's homepage and the URL at the top. But it includes important study level documentation about each project and each wave. And by the way, the portal is freely accessible. Starting with the search function, because it's probably the easiest entree to the portal. Intelligent search is really crucial to secondary users or researchers who might, they're probably not familiar with the tens of thousands of variables that Midas has, or in which data sets those variables are. The portal can search keywords and specific metadata fields and across all the Midas data sets, and also array the search results in a meaningful way. So using the search menu at the top, here I have performed a search for variables related to smoking. And the portal highlights or searches metadata fields such as question text, variable labels, even assigned conceptual labels. And it highlights in yellow the text found in these different fields. You can see the portal here, it's actually searches for variations on the search term as well. And let's say that I wanted to examine variable A1PA42 a little bit more closely. If I click on the variable name, I can explore full variable level metadata in detail, including the label, the question text, any interviewer instructions or skip patterns, the data set it's found in, and also some basic descriptive statistics. And I can also scroll to the previous or the next variable by clicking these links. Now, you know, the search function allows you to drill into the individual variable level metadata, and it's not vastly different from what you can get from Codebook. But, you know, a principal reason for conducting longitudinal research is to compare the same measures over time. And this is where DDI Lifecycle can really help document complicated linked data and clarify, you know, which variables are related to each other, and even provide users a heads up when those variables might not be strictly equivalent. So using the Explorer menu, I can manually peruse each of the project's variables by topic. Remember, there's 5 different projects. In this case, I'm looking at the survey project and the topic of history of smoking. When I click on history of smoking, I see a concordance table pop up to my right, listing all the different versions of smoking variables across 7 survey data sets. Now, each of these 7 instance variables listed under the data sets is linked to or associated by a conceptual variable. And this first row's conceptual variable is the age at which the respondent had their first cigarette. Now, the nice thing about the concordance table is it shows where equivalent versions exist across different data sets, across different waves, but also where those variables are absent. And in this view, I can click on any individual variable and drill down into that variable's metadata, or I can click on a conceptual variable. And let's say that I wanted to examine all the variables associated with the concept of whether the respondent lived with a mother who smoked. If I click on the conceptual variable label, I'm brought to a page that does describe all those variables, all those instance variables associated with this. And I can also see harmonization information about these supposedly equivalent variables. The concordance table on the previous slide showed that this variable wasn't present in every data set or every wave. And the comparability notes that I've highlighted here, they tell me this particular measure was introduced as a baseline measure in later waves. There's also a kind of rudimentary graph of the responses or distributions of each variable that can be kind of useful for quick comparisons across data sets. And there's also some descriptive statistics of each that are available as well. And finally, with the portal able to search across, you know, tens of thousands of variables and to display information on related variables, it'd be really nice, we thought, to have a custom data extract function to accompany all these benefits. So instead of requiring users to download whole data sets and whittle them down to the variables that are interested and then perform merges so that they can actually get an analytic data set, the portal really kind of greatly simplifies finding, accessing, and merging these variables into a single custom data set that also comes with custom documentation as well. Now, at any point in the portal, if I see a shopping cart icon next to an instance variable or conceptual variable, the icon turns orange to indicate it's been added to my variable basket. So in this case, I clicked on the conceptual variable age at first cigarette, and all of the 7 instance variables are added to my basket for eventual download. Under the basket menu, the portal gives me a few options. I can name my custom data set. I can download the data in a few formats and the metadata in a few different formats as well, and it shows the variables that I've added to my basket. And the data set I download, the variables that are in my basket, whether they're from different waves or different projects, data sets, they're automatically merged into one customized data set. And here's a variable view from SPSS of the demo data set. So the portal in this case it's created a wide formatted or flat data set with 7 variables from different data sets. And it includes default administrative variables like respondent and sample identifiers as well. Not only custom data set, but I can also download a customized PDF codebook to accompany my data set. And it includes important information about question text and all that variable level metadata, versioning, provenance, harmonization, all the information that's not included in the data set's metadata, right? And I can actually also download the actual DDI XML for this codebook as well, if that's what I want to look at or if I want to use it in some way. So the key takeaway really for DDI Lifecycle is that you can describe complex social science research metadata with structured machine actionable elements and properties using tools. And some of the bells and whistles demonstrated in this tool, in the Collectica portal, like the data downloads or maybe even the graphical visualizations. While they're not directly supported by DDI Lifecycle, having a structured metadata spec really kind of provides the basis for delivering such functionality in DDI tools. And that's kind of a whirlwind demonstration of DDI Lifecycle, and then I'm going to hand it off to Arafat.
Thanks, Barry. So Jane and Barry got to talk about the products that have been out in the real world for a while and are being implemented, and they can show you lots of neat screenshots and things. I can't, because what I'm going to talk to you about now is sort of what's coming down the pike at us. I'm the sort of acting chair of the MRT group, which is developing DDI cross-domain integration, which is a different kind of thing. Next slide, please, Barry. So it's a new specification, and it's currently in revision after a prolonged public review, and it's going to be released this summer. So it's a coming reality, and it's been prototyped and things, but it's not in production use yet. For a long period of time, the DDI community engaged in the creation of what we call DDI-4 or DDI moving forward, which was a very, very extensive model of all kinds of metadata in this space. It was based on lifecycle, but it went well beyond lifecycle, and it incorporated a lot of thinking from other models and specifications. And at the end of the day, it was simply very big. And DDI-CDI is sort of an implementation of a part of that model, so that we wanted to have a specification that did something useful and that didn't have the entire complexity of this very large conceptual model. But what we ended up with was a specific focus on cross-domain data integration. I'll talk about why that is in a minute. It's a model-based standard. So although there is an XML syntax representation, it is primarily described in a UML formalization. So it's a formal model, but it's not a syntax-bound one, because we expect some people will use the XML, some people will want to use JSON, LD, or RDF, or a host of any other sort of programming languages and representations. And the model itself shouldn't particularly change. It's designed very much to be machine actionable in the same way that DDI Lifecycle was. Now, it is not a replacement for Codebook. It is not a replacement for DDI Lifecycle. It is really intended to extend their coverage to support integration with data from other domains that is different than what DDI Codebook and Lifecycle typically describe. And that use case is becoming more common. It's also kind of as a result of that, in essence, a standalone spec that could be used with other domain metadata specifications outside of the social sciences. And that's something that we've started looking at. Next slide, please, Barry. One question here is, why do you need a new specification? And I have some really good quotes that actually say that the volume of research data is increasing exponentially. So people talk about this. When you look into it, you find out that they're not crying wolf, that there really is a lot more data out there. And partly this is because we have a lot of new data sources, and that's just sort of a function of the digitization of society, I guess. But a lot of that data is in new formats and new structures. We didn't used to think of geolocated tweets as data, and now we do. And so increasing that increasing volume of data is partly because things that didn't used to be data have become data. So there are a lot of new sources, and this means that more flexible approaches to metadata become increasingly useful, in fact. The other reason for DDI, CDI specifically are what we term the grand challenges. So when you look at COVID-19, when you could look at climate change, and those are just the two that are in the news every day, there are these inherently cross-disciplinary topics that urgently require research, right, to inform policy, to inform interventions. And those things mean that there is a growing demand for researchers to share data outside of their traditional domains. We also have a lot of new technologies and new approaches, and I'm talking about things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, some of the big data technology. And that means that what used to be out of bounds from a pure capability perspective is now doable. And things that weren't really data have become data or can be turned into data. And so you see this interest in data coming from outside the domain increasingly. The thing about this is that when you're looking at really large volumes of data, you're talking about big problems of scale. And the only way you can really deal with those problems is by using computers to help you. So machine actionability for harvesting metadata and for navigating data and finding the associated metadata. This becomes a very big challenge in a fair data sharing scenario because the amount of metadata you need is actually larger than within a domain, and the metadata itself is likely not to be in a standard form. Next slide, please, Barry. So what DDI CDI does is it takes the traditional sort of domain description, DDI Codebook, DDI Lifecycle, and then extends that to some other kinds of data types. So we do describe rectangular data sets, the traditional wide or flat data sets that Barry was talking about, but we also describe event data and streaming data, what you call a tall data set, sensor data. We talk about big data stores and NoSQL stores, which we term key value data. And we also look at multidimensional data, like cubes, indicators, time series. So part of what DDI CDI does is that it allows you to map those different forms of data into the metadata that you are able to work with inside your domain so that you can begin to integrate data across these disparate structures. We're not talking here about the semantics, we're talking about the structure primarily. The other thing that it does is that it looks at the provenance of data. When you start exchanging data across domain boundaries, you find that people who might be very familiar with the research and the data within their own domain are not so familiar with those things in a different domain. And so you need to provide a lot more context. Part of that context is an explanation of where the data comes from the collection point through to the point where you're trying to reuse it. So how is it processed? And there are a lot of other standards in that space. Go back, Barry. You got ahead of me. Nope, other direction. Thank you. There are a lot of other standards in that space, like Pravo, SDTL. I won't go into those, but there's a lot of reliance in DDI CDI on using other pre-existing standards for describing provenance. But that's a big part of what you need to understand when you use data from another domain. The key to this is that it really addresses things at the variable level and below, what we call a datum-centric approach. And so you can actually track the path of an individual cell through a process as it's transformed from one domain into another. And that becomes very metadata intensive, but also quite a powerful thing. Next slide now, Barry. When it comes to things related to Dublin Core, as Jared mentioned, The citational metadata in DDI is traditionally mapped to the DC elements and into those namespaces, and that's not going to change for DDI-CDI. Dublin Core also pops up in one way and another in a lot of other popular technologies and standards these days, one of which is schema.org, as you probably know. And so one of the things we've done with DDI-CDI is to map it to schema.org. Additionally, we're in discussions with the DCAT group, which is the W3C data catalog vocabulary. And they don't do data variable descriptions. So they're similar to Dublin Core in that way, but they are specifically focused on data. And so we're talking about how they might be able to use the DDI-CDI very fine-grained variable description and create a sort of formal link between a DCAT data catalog entry, which is sort of Dublin Core based, and the more detailed information that you'd find in DDI-CDI. So we're trying to work with other standards out there in a practical way that will make the very granular metadata available through existing standards and technologies. And that's sort of the approach we're taking. At the end of the day, DDI-CDI does not overlap with a lot of what's described in Dublin Core or other discovery ontologies, because it just relies on them for that information. So in the same way that it describes very granular data that is at a higher level in a study described in DDI-Codebook or DDI Lifecycle, it could rely on any other standard for data coming from outside that domain that was described in DCAT or Dublin Core, for instance. So there's sort of a complementary relationship in that way as well. Last slide, Barry. If you're interested in learning more, you can follow that link, which will take you to the public review draft. There is the draft specification and a lot of documentation. There's a listing of the issues that have been filed during the public review and that are now being addressed. There are also, and this might be the most helpful thing, links to a lot of different webinar recordings and other resources that we conducted during the public review to try to explain the standard to people from outside of the DDI community and even inside the DDI community. So there's a pretty good set of resources there. The other thing you might want to look for is the report that has just been completed today, actually, for the European Open Science Cloud, that is looking at how DDI-CDI might be deployed inside a very large-scale data sharing infrastructure. And that has a lot of very interesting examples. Now, some of you may not be interested in European things specifically, but it is a very good use case for showing how big infrastructure can exchange data across domain boundaries and how you can plug it into a fair ecosystem. And that's that document, I think, would be something you might want to look for if you're wanting to learn more. So DDI-CDI is sort of the next thing, but it's not a replacement. It's an extension, if you will. And I think that's all I've got. Jared, I guess back over to you. Oh, there's the references.
Yeah, thanks, Erfan and Barry and Jane. And thanks to everyone for participating and listening. I think, Jacob, do you want to take it over and handle questions that people may have?
Sure. I'm having a little bit of internet issues, so I'm not going to turn my video back on. But yes, do folks have questions? I suppose I'll ask a question. To what extent is the DDI-CDI work affecting kind of the more XML-based approach that the regular DDI metadata standard has? Is that also going to be translated into kind of model-based approach for multiple serializations?
You want me to take that one, Jared?
Yeah, why don't you take that, Erfan?
Okay. DDI-CDI, the one quote standard representation we have is in XML, because we understand that in the DDI community is the technology base. But when you'll have noticed in Jared's presentation that DDI is also producing RDF vocabularies, and in Barry's presentation, although this isn't something that gets talked about a lot, DDI Lifecycle is now being produced from a conceptual model. So there is a little bit of convergence across the product suite, if you will, on moving to something that isn't as tightly bound to XML, even though that remains the standard implementation in the social sciences community. And that's, I think, in recognition that there are a lot of emerging technologies, particularly around linked data and RDF, but in other ways as well, that people want to use. A lot of the AI applications are now being done with Python, for instance. And so this ability to have a model that can be bound into other syntaxes is very important. That said, we don't expect XML to vanish anytime soon. I'm hoping that answers the question.
Yeah. No, I don't think XML will go away anytime soon. It's extremely popular, even with publishers still. All right, we have a question here from Julie Carmen. What is the best approach if your institution depends on Dublin Core and is not familiar with DDI? How does one get them on board?
Jane, would you like to take this one? Or Arifan or Barry?
It depends what you need it for, is really the question. If you're just going to be describing a single survey, then you would be using Codebook. But, you know, Barry and Arifan both talked about their use cases for the particular products that they were discussing. So that's the very first thing you would have to do. If you go to the DDI Alliance website, it gives information on contact information, or you could send an email right there on the screen in front of you. And that's really the best way to do it, because it's hard to tell you which product to use when we don't really know what you're going to be doing.
Jane, can I follow up what you just said? Jane and I are both involved in the training working group in DDI, and I'm in the subcommittee that handles requests for coming through that form. And what we like to do is arrange a meeting with people and ask them questions about what they're doing, and then point them in the right direction in terms of training materials or whatever the resources are that they might need. And so we try to support people on a case-by-case basis to the extent possible as part of the activity of that group. Anyway, Jen, I just wanted to fill that in because I feel like that's a really good service for people who are seriously looking at the standard.
Okay. More questions. What kind of questions do folks have? It's early in the morning compared to some of our other webinars. Maybe folks have not yet had enough coffee. Let me see. So Rachel Huang is asking, could you link the training resource that you just mentioned? There might also be a Kathy question. Is it possible to put some of these links on the webinar page?
I'm sure we can add it like to the description or something. That would be fine.
So, and
yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, I'm sure it'll be Jared who'll send those links in for you, and you can get links to training materials that are already out there.
Yeah, and if you go to the DDI Alliance website, so it's ddialliance.org, there's a Learn tab, and then that links you to several of the training materials that are available right now. There's also a request a training session link, and I can paste that into the box here. Yeah, so there's a request a training session there if you scroll down. Yep.
All right, brilliant. A couple more questions rolling in. David Piedra, I haven't mispronounced your name. How does DDI fit with solutions like Dataverse?
So Dataverse makes use of the DDI metadata standard as one of the options of describing data. So Dataverse is a tool, and the DDI standard is a way of describing the data in their system. They make use of some other metadata standards as well. Barry or Jane or Arifan, did you want to add to that?
I could add a little bit, Jared. One of the use cases that we did in this document that I talked about from the European Open Science Cloud is actually looking at how DDI CDI might be implemented inside of Dataverse on top of an increased support for DDI codebook at the variable level. And that is a topic that we're actually currently discussing and exploring with the Dataverse community. So there's been a lot of activity in that space recently. I've seen some very interesting demos where people who are depositing statistical package files into Dataverse can automatically generate variable level metadata as part of the ingest process, which means that, and that can save you an awful lot of time. There are some really neat tools being built on top of Dataverse that use the DDI metadata. And one of the nice things about that is that also makes a lot of that metadata available in other formats to other users. And Dublin Core is for sure on that list, as you probably know. So there's a lot going on in that space right now, Jared, and I think that's pretty exciting development, actually.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Arifan. I should note, in addition to Dataverse, and most of the archives making use of DDI are taking advantage of that functionality within the metadata to describe things at the variable level. That's really what sets, one of the main things that sets DDI apart from other metadata standards is the ability to describe individual variables and to use different tools, including Dataverse, ICPSR. We have our own home-built solution where you can view studies at a high level. So that's more of the Dublin Core type elements. And then you can dive in and view not only things like title or author or high-level information, but very specific metadata elements at the study level, methodology, things like universe, sampling. But then you can dive in at the individual variables that Arifan was mentioning that Dataverse provides, ICPSR provides that. Many of the social science archives also, when they're using DDI metadata, they'll generate output so that you can see the individual variable elements, and you can search and browse by those. And so you're able to see not only what has been described generally about the study, but then go in and search and compare across individual questions, view the question text, interviewer instructions, variable responses. And this is all just using DDI-Codebook, which was established, as Jane mentioned, to describe individual studies. Or if you want to describe more longitudinal collections like Barry, that's when making use of DDI Life Cycle and adding even more functionality to compare across waves or collections.
All right, excellent. Another question
If
from
I could just add something, Jacob, before you go on here. I just want to mention, since Barry put this web page up here, that the DDI Alliance web page is an excellent page to go to just to see what's happening. If you look on the lower right-hand side of the screen, there's a news section. And the webinar we're doing today is actually mentioned on it, but there's also another webinar mentioned on it. We're having a series of DDI training series, and Arifan can talk more about that if he wants to, but just to tell you more about the different DDI things that are happening. So just check back on it every now and then to see what's up. Thanks, Jacob.
You bet. Okay, we have another question from Claudia Zalbach. Hopefully I haven't totally murdered your last name. How can I generate DDI XML for a survey? And I'm wondering if Claudia means Are there templates available? Is there an XSD document that can be easily referenced or downloaded? What kinds of resources are there? Or example, like an example XML file that's already been, right, of a complete survey or study.
Jared, do you want me to answer that one?
Yeah, Arifan, why don't you take a shot?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and the answer is it depends, because there is various DDI support in some of the data collection tools. Probably when you're talking about getting a real handle on a questionnaire survey, and I'm assuming that's what you mean by survey, is the questionnaire. DDI Lifecycle is the standard that you're looking at, because it has probably the best questionnaire model in any standard that I've seen. Now, Collectica, which is the software package that Barry showed you, actually has some pretty interesting features working with some of the survey packages. And so if I wanted to know what the current state of play was around getting DDI metadata out of a survey tool, I would actually talk to the guys at Collectica, and they're pretty happy to talk about their product, obviously. There is some other support, not for the survey descriptions themselves, but for the data coming out of surveys. And you see that in some of the more common survey packages, some of the open source ones. That's not as useful if what you're focused on is actually the questionnaire itself and managing that. One very interesting project was done by the statistical office in France, INSEE, where they actually do a corporation survey every year of every business in France. And each survey is customized for each respondent based on the prior year's responses. They actually use DDI Lifecycle XML to generate the survey document itself, which is then sent in electronic form to the companies who fill it out. It comes back, and then they process that data into a form that's automatically documented with DDI Lifecycle. So you can actually use the metadata to start with and get the survey out of it if you want. And that's probably the most advanced example of people who are working with the survey description. But again, Collectica does provide a lot of tools for working from existing survey software and getting the metadata out of them into a DDI lifecycle form.
Arifan, I would just add that as far as questionnaire descriptions in DDI Lifecycle, I actually removed a section of my demo. I was going to demonstrate the closer portal, and they have a big focus on questions and questionnaire descriptions using Lifecycle.
That's a good point, Barry. And then also the QDDT work going on in Norway is another example of that. There's a lot of question bank stuff out there when you think about it.
And finally, I would also note that we do have markup examples and tools, some of which are free through the website that you could get started with if you just wanted to document a survey, a questionnaire, or a data set.
All right, that's excellent. Folks have further questions? Kind of a quiet group this morning. Who want to go ahead and wrap up early by a few minutes?
That's fine with us, Jacob.
I think we can do that if you're not seeing any more questions. It's up to you all.
I'm not seeing any more, and I think it's been a very thorough and excellent presentation to the point where I'm having problems coming up with really good questions myself.
All right. Well, I think everybody, there's several comments that are coming in just saying thank you for the presentation. So I think everybody truly enjoyed it. You had such a terrific registration and a huge audience. So I really want to thank our distinguished panelists for presenting this terrific webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for attending and also thank Jacob for moderating the session. I just want to remind you that one of the many ACES member benefits is complimentary access to all webinars. A recording of today's webinar and a copy of the slides will be posted to the ACES website within 2 to 3 days, and they'll be available to all of today's registrants and ACES members. Within 24 hours, you're going to also receive an email that will include a recording and a survey. And I ask you to please complete the survey within 7 days. Your feedback is really important to planning future webinars. Again, I'm Kathy Nash with the ACES staff, and I thank DCMI for sponsoring this webinar and thank all of you for participating. This concludes the webinar.
Oh, can we get one last question in?
Oh, sure. No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Which I think is maybe a question for you and me. Where do they send questions after the webinar if they have them?
If the presenters are, I think they've posted their email addresses, and if they're okay, then I would say email the presenter directly and they'd be happy to answer your questions.
There's a contact us button. I don't know if you can see it right at the bottom of the web page, and that's probably your best bet.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay,
right.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. This ends the webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.